Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Andrea Morales, and I'm the Indigenous Communities Program Intern at the Latinx Resource Center. Before we begin our programming today, I would like to start us off with a land acknowledgement. The Latinx Resource Center at UCI acknowledges our presence on the ancestral and unceded shared land of the Gabrieleños and Juaneño Hachme Nation, which extends from the Santana River to Aliso Creek and beyond. As a land-grant university, it is vital to acknowledge and make visible UCI's relationship to Native peoples, to recognize the history of the land on which we stand, and to affirm the past, present, and future of the Gabrieleño and Juaneño Hachme Nation here in this place. We recognize that every member of the UCI community has benefited from the use of this land since the institution's founding in 1965. And we acknowledge that the Gabrieleños and Juaneño Hachme Nation continue to hold strong physical, spiritual, and cultural ties to this land today. This acknowledgement is a call to action to all members of the UCI community to learn more about the Gabrieleños and Juaneño Hachme Nation and to learn more about this place where we live, work, and study.
Thank you, and hello. My name is Nada, and I'm a fourth-year environmental science and policy major, and also an intern for the Sustainability Resource Center, where I work on the Environmental Justice Collective. I would like to introduce you all to Dr. Jessica Hernandez, who's joining us today. Dr. Jessica Hernandez is a transnational Indigenous scholar, scientist, and community advocate based in the Pacific Northwest. She has an interdisciplinary academic background ranging from marine sciences to environmental physics. Her work is grounded in her Indigenous cultures and ways of knowing. She advocates for climate, energy, and environmental justice through her scientific and community work, and strongly believes that Indigenous sciences can heal our Indigenous lands. She primarily focuses on Indigenous-led and community-based environmental and climate research projects. These projects center Indigenous peoples, Indigenous knowledge and science in natural resource management and science curriculum. Her book, Fresh Banana Leaves, Healing Indigenous Landscapes Through Indigenous Science, breaks down why Western conservationism isn't working and offers Indigenous models informed by case studies, personal stories, and family histories that center the voices of Latin American women and land protectors. She's in the process of writing her second book, Growing Papaya Trees, Nurturing Roots of Indigenous Displacement. She currently holds appointments at Sustainable Seattle, City of Seattle's Urban Forestry Commission, and the International Mayan League. So without further ado, I'll pass it to Dr. Hernandez, and we can get started.
Thank you for the introduction. Buen día, Paducci. As already mentioned, my name is Dr. Jessica Hernandez, but feel free to call me Jessica. Okay, so today we'll be presenting on Indigenous futures and the impacts of land grants. So before we begin, I would like to show you where you can actually scan the QR code so that you can actually actively participate in this presentation. If you do not have a QR scanner, you can also go to www.menti.com and enter the code 82737938 so that you can actually see the presentation on your computer or laptop screen. So I will give you like 10 seconds to make sure you can log in. So I would also like to acknowledge the lands where I'm virtually presenting from. So I'm virtually presenting from the lands and the shared waters of the Duwamish and Coast Salish people, also known as Seattle, named after Chief Sealth. So I also want to give the audience opportunity to also acknowledge the Indigenous lands where you're joining from. So again, make sure to log into menti.com and please type in the Indigenous lands you're currently calling from, and I will read out some aloud for all of us. I see that we have people from Tongva lands. Pañeño and Ahachamin. Hopefully I'm pronouncing those correctly. Please correct me if I'm mispronouncing them. Okay, so a lot of people from Tongva lands. So thank you for participating in this. Okay. So as already mentioned, I'm a transnational Indigenous woman, meaning that my Indigenous communities are actually separated by settler borders. If you didn't know, the Maya Chorti community is one of those communities that's separated by 3 borders, including El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. And I am the author of Fresh Banana Leaves, Healing Indigenous Landscapes Through Indigenous Science. So I also want to learn who is in the audience. So take the next 10 seconds to also introduce yourself into 1 or 2 phrases. So tell us who you are and who's in the audience. You can introduce yourselves in any way. Like you don't have to mention your names. You can just mention your identities as well. So a PhD student in anthropology studying university land grants, a 3rd-year Filipino American undergrad studying political and environmental science. A 2nd-year computer science student, community member, just learning. Thank you all for being here today. A PhD candidate at UCI studying visual culture of land struggles, 4th-year Mujer Purepecha majoring in international studies. 1st-generation Mexican American graduate student at UCI, 1st-year PhD student sociology, Afro-Indigenous descent from El Salvador, studying political economy. Thank you for being here. PhD candidate in visual arts or studies at UCI, art, environmental justice, waste, animals. 5th-year environmental science and policy student, 1st-generation Salvadorian and Mexican American student studying environmental science and policy. Chicana mom, daughter, and granddaughter. So thank you everyone for being here today, and I hope that this space is welcoming to all your identities. Okay. So I always like to start all my presentations by making this question to the audience. Can one Indigenous person speak for all Indigenous peoples? So make sure you respond yes, no, or not sure. Okay, so I'm seeing a lot of no's, and that is actually what I like to emphasize, that one Indigenous person cannot speak for all Indigenous peoples. And that's because, we're not a monolithic group. We are different based on our intersectionalities, identities, and our cultures are place-based. So Coast Salish people from Seattle are different than the Maya Chorti people from my communities that are separated by the borders. And I think that this is important to keep in mind, as this presentation comes from my own perspectives, my own lived experiences, and my place-based knowledge and relationships to my lands. So I actually come from a matriarchal society through my maternal lineage of the Zapotec Nation. And basically what this matriarchal society means is that it's completely the opposite of what patriarchy entails. So in a matriarchal society, our women hold the primary power positions in roles of authority. In a broader sense, it can also extend to moral authority, social privilege, and control of property. So we were in a space gathering in my nations, the women, our matriarchs, our elders, will actually speak first, and then all the women around the room will go. And then our non-binary folks that we also consider muses will be the second ones to speak, and our men are the last ones to speak. So we can see how that's kind of like the opposite of what patriarchy actually teaches us, especially in a society where men are given the power and the privilege to kind of speak over women and queer folks. And one of the premises is right that we also see in patriarchy is how it actually manifests in the relationships that we are taught or we sustain with our lands. So I wanted to, in order for us to kind of dive into this discussion, I wanted to ask all of you, how does patriarchy impact you and or benefit you? So take the next 10 seconds to kind of mention how does patriarchy impact and or benefit you? And this will allow us to reflect on how patriarchy is manifested in our identities, intersectionalities, and also dive into connecting it to the relationships that we have with our lands today. We see that it fetishizes and exploits bodies, especially bodies. It takes away my autonomy and limits my opportunities in professional and academic spaces. It's made it difficult for me to recognize my own worth and realize my potential. Was raised to be quiet and I have a voice, sexual violence. Being in the same sex relationship, there's always the assumptions that there is a man in our relationships. I sometimes feel that I shouldn't or can't take up space. Need to increase presence of women of color in leadership. It benefits me by creating more opportunities for me to succeed in other people, prioritizes masculine traits and displays of masculinity. In a traditional workspace, I will have to report to a male employer or boss. Yeah, so thank you for sharing all of these ways that patriarchy is manifested in our lives. So now diving into the relationships that we have with our land, how does patriarchy currently impact our relationships to the land? So take the next 10 seconds to formulate your responses to our question. How does patriarchy currently impact our relationships to the land? So some of the responses, it justifies the worldview of domination and control, extraction, hierarchical relationships, take, takes away from our autonomy and connection to the land, increases extraction exploitation, abusing land and taking it for granted, male dominated and colonial. Yes. Causes endless and unsustainable exploitation. Exploitation will continue to worsen extraction and monetize relationships. So thank you for participating. As we can see in all of our responses, it kind of falls into the same nexus, right? The same interconnection. So as we know, our lands are kind of given the feminine identity. This is why we refer to our planet as Mother Earth, Mother Nature. And as a result of that, right, patriarchy in relationships to our land teaches us that we can own the land, that we can also exploit the land, right? In names of like science, in the name of science, exploration, and things like that, right? Where we can actually have access and authority to exploit our lands. It also teaches us that the land should provide for us, right? Similar to how we view women and also the maternal identity, right? Where we're supposed to nurture and provide for everyone else. So for my research, especially my work and something that I kind of embedded in the book Fresh Banana Leaves, I wanted to look at the intersection of women and the land, and especially taking into account the non-binary discussions, because in our Zapotec community, we actually have a third gender, also known as the muses, and how patriarchy is kind of blurring these lines, especially as we talk about our connection to the land in terms of relations, connections, and responsibilities. So now to kind of tie it back to the University of California, Irvine, where this event is taking place, we're going to be talking about land-grant universities. So take the next 10 seconds to let me know whether you have heard about land-grant universities before. Okay, so we kind of have like, almost half of the audience, yes, no, not sure. Okay. So if you have heard about land-grant universities, just give us the next 10 seconds to tell us what are actually land-grant universities for those in the audience who actually do not know or are not sure what land-grant universities are. So based on our audience participation, land-grant universities mean that this land that's donated to a public institution by the government, annexation of lands for public use, parcels of land that were stolen from indigenous people allotted to certain institutions, universities built on land given by indigenous tribes, university land grounds stolen from indigenous nations and gifted to academic institutions, states depriving indigenous peoples of their land and providing them to developing universities in the name of educating a new class of workers and students, land stolen from indigenous peoples to benefit universities. So yes, that is all correct, right? When we look at land grants and universities, it's important for us to also reflect on the land relationships that these kind of connections between land grants and universities have, and also the connections and the historical histories, right, that they have in regards to indigenous people. So thank you everyone who participated, because I feel like we already addressed some of these connections in our previous discussion. So to give you a little bit more of a history, right, we have the Morrill Act signed into law by President Abraham Lincoln on 1862, where he created the so-called land-grant universities, right, where this was donating land left over from building the transcontinental railroad to fund the creation of institutions of higher learning, charged, with educating citizens from all walks of life and advancing research in the cutting edge fields of the day, right? And those during those days, those fields were agriculture and engineering. And one of the things that it's important to kind of recognize and also kind of dig in and kind of immerse ourselves into that responsibility and accountability to also learn are the hidden histories, right, that need to be learned so that we can collectively undo past injustices, especially when we're speaking about colonial institutions such as higher academic, universities, where there's also a colonial legacy, but also this colonial legacy of land grant universities, where we know that these were lands that were stolen from indigenous peoples that were kind of considered right left over during the exploration and extraction of our lands to give to higher education entities. So I wanted to kind of share the story of a man named Ishi. And I wanted to ask you, have you heard of Ishi before? Yes or no? Okay, so most of the audience hasn't heard of Ishi before. And one of the reasons why I wanted to integrate this history in this story is because it kind of ties to the movement where land grant universities were actually being built. And during that time period, there was still the colonization and the genocide being, taking place against indigenous peoples. And the story of Ishi kind of integrates the land grant universities and also the colonial histories of the lands where these universities are built on that are integrated into the indigenous histories of what we know, today as California. So I wanted to play this video and share like a couple of minutes so that we can learn more about a man called Ishi, the last of the Yahis, the end of an era, but not forgotten. And let me know if you can hear the video.
Who is Ishi? I think we may not ever really know who Ishi is. He was a child who was born and raised in a culture that we knew nothing about at the time, and he died before you know, many people really had a chance to know who he really was, and there was the language barrier. So it was probably hard to know who exactly Ishi was.
Who was Ishi? Well, he was a Native American that the story says he came out of the hills into the slaughterhouse in Orville, and that's where he was discovered.
Who is Ishi? Well, Ishi is not only an important Native American figure, but also a very symbolic Native American figure.
Ishi is a man known as the last wild Indian in North America. He was the sole survivor of a tribe that was exterminated between 1850 and 1870. You know, it's the best documented case of genocide in North America. It's a true story of extermination as public policy. I think Ishi's story is more about us than it is about Ishi.
We're here at the Butte County Historical Society's Museum in Oroville, where we have an exhibit on Ishi, who was the Native American man who came in and basically turned himself over to the white culture in Oroville 100 years ago. This is 2011, and it was 1911 on August 28th when Ishi came into Oroville.
I mean, we know in 1908 that his camp was found. He lost contact, we're assuming, with what was left of his family. There were just 3 or 4 individuals. And then there's a 3-year period there we don't know where he was.
I grew up in Ishi country and had heard the Yahi stories ever since I was a very young child. I grew up below Black Rock, and my Indian grandmother was full-blooded Maidu and Pit River. And she used to tell many stories of not just Ishi, but the Yahi tribe in whole. The wilds of Mill Creek would make anyone wonder how in the world anybody could survive in there, but they were all knowledgeable how to survive.
In 1911, Ishi came out of the foothills of Tehama and Butte County to Oroville and had left his refuge been living alone for a while after his family had died, and came into Oroville to essentially surrender himself to modern civilization and Butte County Sheriff.
The young boy who found him, whose name was Ad Kessler, like we would do, we would call law enforcement and say, you know, we found this guy, we don't know what to do with him. So they brought him in to Oroville and couldn't communicate with him because of the language barrier. No one knew his language, and they did a certain amount by gestures, but they couldn't really communicate with him. And so the only safe place they could think of for him was the jail. Here we're looking at the actual prison register, or a copy of it, that when Ishi was booked into the jail in Oroville on the day that he was found, the evening that he was found. And it reads August 28th, 1911, Indian, wild.
He didn't realize, you know, that what would happen after that, but being captured and everything, that had to be very scary to him. He didn't know what was going to happen. Maybe they would kill him next. You know, he just didn't know.
Kroiber, who was the anthropologist from Berkeley, who came up to Oroville, you know, to find Ishi. When Ishi was discovered, of course, they didn't know what to do with him, and one of the possibilities was to kill him, you know, and fortunately he was saved.
Ishi actually only spent, about less than 2 weeks in Oroville before he went on to San Francisco.
He was in some ways adopted by the Department of Anthropology at UC Berkeley. Kroeber and some of his colleagues came to study what was being referred to as the last wild Indian.
Ishi was not his name. That name was given to him by the Kroebers and his Saxon Pope. They gave him that name, which literally meant man or something of that nature. And it's not the Indian way to give our names to a society that after all, killed off his tribe. He wasn't going to give that kind of history, and that's not something you did anyway. But I think there is a reason why he went there, and without reluctance went to the jail, went to Berkeley, and all that.
I think he totally changed Alfred Kroeber's ideas about the intelligence of indigenous people in North America. And when you realize that Kroeber trained 40% of the people in the field of anthropology at one time, that's incredibly dramatic. That means he was able to influence an entire generation of anthropologists and change the paternalistic way of looking at Indian people to looking at them as real, function, fully capable humans that they are.
So just to give a little bit more of a background of Ishi, on August 29, 1911, a Yahi man known as Ishi came out of hiding near Oroville, California. He has spent decades evading settlers after the massacre of his community in the 1860s and had recently lost, his entire family. So as a result of that, right, when white settlers during that time came in contact with him, or in, like they were mentioning in the video, discovered him, he was considered the last of his kind. So he was brought into the University of California anthropology museums, as it was mentioned, described as the last wild Indian. So he actually spent his final years living at a museum, and in this case located at the University of California, Berkeley. And Ishi may be known in Indian country and to the California public school students, but his story remains mostly obscure, especially given that millions of acres of indigenous lands were sold and endowed to the land-grant universities of the United States. So I, recommend looking at this website in the pulitzercenter.org, where it talks about stories like Ishi's and how it's actually connected to land-grab universities, right? And in that sense, it kind of allows us to see that indigenous histories that were still taking place during this, time period where these lands were actually given to these higher institution settings, and how indigenous peoples were treated, right? So oftentimes as indigenous scholars, as indigenous faculty, we're still living the byproducts of those histories, right? Because we know that these, universities, especially land-grant universities, were created to study us, to study our people, as opposed to, educate us, right? So when we look at land-grant universities, we have to question who were the people or communities that were actually benefiting from stolen indigenous lands being converted and building universities in this capacity. So, I wanted us to kind of reflect on what we just saw and some of the history that we saw in terms of Ishi and what land-grant universities are. So how does the history and treatment of Ishi by the UC system demonstrate the colonial legacy of our institutions? So take the next 10 seconds to kind of reflect on that, and, feel free to be as honest as you will like, as these answers are anonymous. So to repeat the question, how does the history and treatment of Ishi by the UC system demonstrate the colonial legacy of our institution, especially pertaining to the University of California university systems? So some of the responses: erasure of indigenous perspectives. They like to profit off of our lands and people. Indigenous bodies treated as commodities, yet at the same time glorified for professional gains. UC system will do anything in its power to place the value of land as commodity above all else, including the destruction of people's lives. A living person treated as a property, as an artifact. That's correct. Absolute exploitation of land and people, no stone left unturned. The exploitation, researching indigenous peoples and histories without actually trying to benefit them. That's correct. Eugenics as a constant, indigenous peoples treated as commodities by the gatekeepers of higher education. This means that indigenous peoples are unlawfully displaced and dislocated from the purpose of educating a body of intelligent and world-changing students. Yeah, thank you everyone for participating. The UC system used indigenous resources for knowledge and profit without considering indigenous backgrounds and ownership. Yes, I think that, one of the ways that I wanted for us to reflect is, understanding Ishi's history, especially a history that the UC system kind of took part in, where during that time period, there was colonization, there was the genocide against indigenous peoples. And as a result, when they came in contact with this Native American man from the Yahi tribe, they kind of, started labeling him as the last indigenous person on earth, right? And that kind of shows the separation that the UC system in its colonial history had towards indigenous peoples. So I think that, as students and professionals and staff from the UC Irvine educational institution, one of the things that I want us to do is to collectively reflect on what actions we can take to start addressing these past injustices that ultimately connect to present day injustices against indigenous peoples, right? Because when we talk about a lot of these things that, demonstrate how the UC system treated Ishi during that, that time period of the 1800s, for many of us is still something that's our present day, lived experiences and injustices. So for the next 10 seconds, let's think about what actions we can take to start addressing these past injustices that ultimately connect to present day injustices against indigenous peoples. And I think that hopefully, our discussions will inspire us to take some action and to collectively heal and move towards a more just, future, especially as it pertains to indigenous peoples, indigenous futures. So there are no wrong answers. So feel free to just reflect and tell us what you think. Some of our responses is first, make the just injustices visible to all, struggle forward towards land back, learn about the history of indigenous peoples, engage in self-reflection of their stories, and support native-owned businesses, repatriating land even if it's expensive or disruptive. Listen to what indigenous people want, give reparations to affected communities, educate in all California schools about what transpired. Include conversations about the injustices at every level of the university, yes, undergrad and mint. Have events and curriculum so students are aware of what they're learning, continue to listen to indigenous peoples. And one of the responses, right, that kind of that I can see connected to my lived experiences is, right, like educated in all California schools about what transpired. Because oftentimes when we're coming from high school, like I grew up in South Central Los Angeles, so I came from the LA school system, we're taught to aspire to go into the Cal State universities or the University of California systems. But yet, as indigenous peoples, we're not even told the histories that kind of persisted or took place pertaining, against our people in these systems, right? So how do we collectively ensure that these histories are taught, especially at all levels, from administration to students? So thank you for those responses. And I think that, it's important when we talk about land grab universities and land back, right, the movement, we have to talk about colonization and this notion of manifest destiny. So manifest destiny, for those who don't know, was a widely held cultural belief in the 19th century of the United States that American settlers were destined to expand across North America. So we see that, in this picture that depicts manifest destiny, there was the violent removal of indigenous peoples, a lot of our, buffalo, our native cultural keystone species that play a major role in indigenous peoples' lives of the Americas. And we also see the railroads, building of that, right? So we see how through manifest destiny, as mentioned, land grant universities were actually lands that were, on quotation marks, left over from, building those railroads that were granted to universities so that they can educate a population of the society. So I wanted to, also ask us, how did colonization impact indigenous peoples? Give us other examples as well. So the question is, how did colonization impact indigenous peoples? So it removed autonomy to be respected knowledge producers in society, cultural erasure, loss of indigenous lands and ways of knowing, complete destruction of indigenous societies, communities, and way of life, affected every aspect of their lives, and ultimately their identity, displacement from home and sacred lands, elimination of food systems, lifeways, forced dependency on colonial capitalist economic institutions, violent removal of indigenous peoples from their ancestral lands, disease and deprivation of cultures and traditions. So thank you all for participating in this. And, you know, as a trained scientist, especially since I saw that a lot of us are in environmental sciences or environmental studies, one of the other ways that colonization, right, and this notion of manifest destiny impacted indigenous peoples is through the introduction of Western and modern science. So when we look at science, we know that Western and modern science follows a linear way of thinking, right? Because we have six-step six-step process where we develop our questions, make a hypothesis, conduct an experiment, draw our observations, analysis, and conclusion, right? So in order for us to be a scientist or practice sciences, especially environmental sciences or any sciences that you're conducting, we have to follow this linear way of thinking in order for us to conduct experiments and draw conclusions. But when we look at the indigenous ways of knowing, and one of the things that I, discuss is indigenous science, right? And so we see how indigenous science is more holistic, is kind of more interconnected, and at the core center of our indigenous science is our spirituality, right? And then we are followed by social norms, plants, medicinal knowledge, dreams, environmental knowledge, and we also integrate those Western science tools, right? So we can see the differences between the Western way of thinking, especially how we conduct science, where it's like a six-step process, and how indigenous science can be more of a web, right? Where it can interconnect many principles, but not removing ourselves from the, science that we practice, especially when it comes to our spirituality, right? And that's not necessarily determined by Western religion, but more of the spirituality that we hold as individuals and beings on this earth. So I wanted to, ask us, what differences do you notice between indigenous science and Western and modern science? So I'm gonna go back to, the scientific method so that we can see it again, and then indigenous science. So let me open the question, and then I'm gonna put the screen to our indigenous science framework. So how is indigenous science different from Western science? Indigenous science is much more interdisciplinary and incorporates many different aspects of healing. Western science discounts spirituality completely, assumes there's only one right way to go about things and everyone else wrong. Indigenous, more holistic approach that takes into account all aspects of human experience of the world. Indigenous science incorporates elements of nature over technology. Indigenous science centers community spirituality. It's rooted in spirituality, whereas Western science actively removes itself from it. That's correct. Indigenous science recognizes more various sources of knowledge. Okay, thank you everyone for participating. So going back to indigenous science, right, we know that there is the spiritual connection and, kind of connecting our entire presentation, right, from land grant universities to like the relationship that patriarchy has with our lands. We can see how indigenous science kind of puts makes us a part of nature, especially given that many of our creation stories are rooted in being created by our deities, gods, and goddesses from our natural elements, from our native animals, our native plants, and also non-living relatives. We also see that in our traditional clothing, how our clothing kind of reflects our nature, our landscapes, and it kind of serves as a canvas to how lands are viewed, right? So now we're coming to, connecting all of these elements, right? Patriarchy and the relationship we have with our lands, land grant universities, indigenous histories, and indigenous science. So one of the, metaphors that I like to tell people, especially for those of us who are not raised in indigenous cultures, right, is that indigenous science is looking at an entire puzzle that's completed versus Western science, we're focusing on only 2 or 3 puzzle pieces. So we see how in Western science, as many of us noted, there's this kind of fracture, right? Especially when it comes to spirituality, our relationships to nature. And as a result of that, we see how Western science continues to uphold patriarchal norms, right? Because as we were analyzing, patriarchy has kind of disrupted our relationships with the land. And as a result of that, when we look at the histories of many university land grant universities, right, like UCI, many of those people who were actually allowed to gain an education were actually men, right? So women were not even allowed to step foot in those campuses. So I wanted us to kind of reflect and kind of come into, the final stages of our presentation. How can Indigenous science help us fortify human relationships with the lands? So let's take the next 10 seconds to reflect on this. How can Indigenous science help us fortify human relationships with the land? So recognize the land as more than a resource to consume. Know that capitalism is inherently violent and destructive, and that there are much better ways for people to organize their relationships with each other and land. Build relationships based on care and regeneration rather than exploitation and extraction. We can learn to respect nature and utilize natural remedies to promote healing. Center the well-being of the land as part of our daily lives, thinking of land as a being with a spirit that we cannot just take away from. Appeal to emotional, spiritual, cultural aspects of decision making about land. Yes, those are all, great responses. It can provide methods to protect, observe the land, and how we are connected to it. Okay, thank you everyone for participating. So, to kind of wrap up our presentation, I wanted to also ask, why is it important to grapple, and that's a, typo, with the land grant history UCI has hidden for so many years? So why is it important for us to look at the history hidden between the land grants and the UC systems that has been hidden for so many years? So to start the process for reparations, we have to recognize that as student, staff, faculty of UCI, we're benefiting from the land grant history. There's an ongoing legacy of oppression due to a system built to be destructive, and it's that very system that needs to be smashed. So we can contribute to undoing, or at least making known, the harms and violence upon which UCI was founded and continues to perpetrate. It sets a precedent that it cannot be ignored. so current students and prospective students understand the history and cultural identity the land sits on. Yeah, thank you everyone for your responses. Right, so like a takeaway message is that it is important to learn the indigenous histories of the land we're currently living or settled on, and find ways to support present day indigenous peoples and communities to advocate for indigenous futures, right? And I think that, I wanted to end this with a book reading, especially given that, I introduced myself as a transnational indigenous woman. And as a result of that, right, one of the teachings that my grandmother instilled in me was that anywhere I walked or stepped foot in, it was my responsibility to learn the histories so that I could become a welcome guest, especially as an indigenous woman who is not currently in their homelands. So I will start my reading. My cultural and family roots will always continue to play a major role in the legacy I will get to leave as a future ancestor. They also remind me that anywhere I go, I'm either an unwelcome guest or a welcome guest. This was a teaching my grandmother instilled in me at a young age whenever I would visit her in my maternal homelands. She would tell me, never forget that anywhere you go that is not your home, it is someone's home. And you must pay them respect and build relationships with the land and the people to be welcome into their home. Otherwise, you're walking into their home as an unwelcome guest. This reminder and teaching shaped how I carry myself as a displaced Indigenous woman. I do not forget that I have the responsibility of an unwelcome guest to carry on my teachings and work to build relationships with the stewards of my new home and lands. This is a constant reminder that I'm always residing on Indigenous lands, no matter if I move into a city or rural location within the United States. This entire continent, north of North America and the rest of the Americas, Central America, South America, and the Caribbean, are Indigenous lands. The same way I expect guests to behave in my homelands and build relationships with our land and our people is the same way I carry myself as a displaced Indigenous woman. So I think, some of the premises to kind of interconnect everything that we have been discussing, right, is that we have to reflect on even looking at, how if somebody just walked into our home, how will we expect them to behave, especially, in a place that is known to be our sanctuary, where, we have our memories and, have our family gatherings. And I think that when we apply that concept to the lands that we're residing on, especially as university students, we are kind of reflecting on how we can take those actions and kind of use our positionality, right, as mentioning before, to kind of tell those hidden histories so that we can start understanding how we can undo the injustices that took place and how we can promote land reparations moving forward, right, especially as Indigenous peoples, because unless you're native to the Irvine locations, right, we have been displaced, whether externally, which is across borders, or internally. So I think that, hopefully that's the overall message that this short presentation kind of allow us to see. So thank you. And if you have any questions, you can either submit them in the chat, or you can also address, type in your questions in the Mentimeter as well. So thank you, everyone.
All right. Hi, Dr. Hernandez. Can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, awesome. You are so great to exemplify this popular education principle and pull all of this knowledge from the audience. But I'm wondering what your own question is to what your own answer is to what are some things that we can do as UCI as our first steps to start to acknowledge this history of the land grant.
Yeah, thank you. And I think that, when we were having these discussions to kind of come up with this presentation, right, one of the things is just even consulting with the Indigenous communities to see how the Indigenous land should be recognized and acknowledged, especially, when we're welcoming people into these spaces. And I think that, based on what I have heard, UCI is already taking those measures to be in consultation with the indigenous peoples of the lands to kind of, create a land acknowledgement. And I think that oftentimes, there's a critique that land acknowledgements can do so much, but at least when they're told, right, we're acknowledging the indigenous presence and the history that the university has, built on and still kind of perpetrates. And I think that, always advocating for more indigenous faculty and also bringing in indigenous guest speakers so that we can all learn, right? Because as mentioned, we are all different. We all have different intersectionalities, and hopefully, that fosters some reflection. And I guess the last takeaway will just be to reflect, on our own and kind of see what kind of actions we can take, right? Because we all have different abilities, different resources, but we can all do something, especially when it pertains to, healing and collectively moving forward indigenous futures and land liberations. Thank you for that question.
Oops. I'm wondering if there are any other questions from the audience, or I can't see the chat, so I don't know. But I also have a question. I'll stand here so you can see me. There you go. And my question is, shared with us like some of the elements of indigenous sciences. And I'm wondering, like, as folks who are in the environmental sciences, like I personally, I am in the environmental sciences, how can we as students start to incorporate some of the elements of indigenous sciences into the ways that we practice environmental science?
Thank you for that question. And I think that one of the things that when I teach, students, especially at the University of Washington, it's important to acknowledge that, we are in indigenous lands. So one of the ways that we can start doing that is by looking at the indigenous communities and what kind of movements or environmental projects they're currently leading, especially when it pertains to healing our environments, to protecting our Mother Earth. And I think one of the ways to also do that is to kind of learn from indigenous peoples, right? Because when we look at the historical accounts of Western Academy, indigenous knowledges are nowhere to be found. Yet, a lot of our communities are adapting and mitigating climate change and creating those solutions, but yet they're nowhere to be found because, we don't have those Western credentials, or we don't publish or peer review publish our, findings, our community efforts. So I think that, learning what the local indigenous communities are doing and learning from them so that we can foster better relationships, especially knowing that we are working in colonial institutions, right? Like, I do not forget the fact that University of Washington also has a colonial history similar to the UC systems. And how do we foster creating solutions moving forward that are not necessarily, like manifesting those colonial histories, further as well. Thank you for that question.
Questions. I think there are some questions in the chat if we want to transition to those. So I guess I could facilitate. So I think a question that Melanie is asking in the chat is, how can we as non-Native people uplift the stories of Indigenous folks without speaking for them or overwriting their histories?
I think that one of the ways is to, just invite people to tell their own histories and stories and to also write them because, we see even going back to the history of Ishi and his story and how his story has been told to the fact that, nowadays many people do not necessarily like understand his story to the full extent. These are just, like, oh, he was the last native from this tribe, but that probably wasn't the case, right? And how can we elevate those stories? And I think also teaching students speaking about those things in our classes, especially in our classes where we don't see that indigenous representation, right? Like now everyone can talk about Ishi and when we were talking about land grants and also how universities, treat indigenous peoples, because that's a history that's, in UC Berkeley on the campus, we have a Ishi court, right? Where it was like where he was actually being kept. So I think that, how do we amplify that history and seeing how, there are other kind of red flags in our campuses that kind of are hiding those indigenous histories, right? Because this Ishi history is more, in the north, kind of north, Berkeley, but, there's also histories similar to Ishi's, especially at the Irvine campus. So how do we, find those histories and make sure that we share them among our peers and colleagues as well? Thank you for that question.
Um, Seeing that there aren't any additional questions, I'm wondering if should we transition to raffles and stuff? Okay, perfect. So, for folks that are on Zoom, I think there's a link. Actually, I'm not quite sure. No. Okay, yeah. So we're gonna pick our raffle winners. Woohoo! Or I think we're doing 5. Oh.
Oh, hi. She was here earlier.
Okay.
Oh, there she is. Hi, Isabella.
Natalia.
So you should put it.
As we're picking raffle winners, Melanie. As we're picking raffle winners, feel free to fill out the survey link that has just been dropped in the chat about today's session. As you entering the survey, finishing the survey also enters you in another opportunity drawing to win more books, more copies of Dr. Hernandez's book. So, courtesy of the publisher.
You know what number around?
Each time it gets longer.
Yeah. Wait, two more. That one. Oh, she's here.
All right, I think we've selected all of our raffle winners. So with that, we can wrap up. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Dr. Hernandez, for joining us today. We learned so much, and I had a great time. And yeah, stay tuned. Finish this, complete the survey, and stay tuned for the winners for that as well. But thank you all for coming, and have a great. Okay, prizes can be picked up for those that weren't here from the Rise Suite, which is on the fourth floor of the Student Center building. And in addition to that, you should check out other events that are happening this Earth Week, which there was a link dropped in the chat a long time ago for that, because there are fun things happening all week long. So we'll see you around at those. Thank you all for being here, and thank you for coming.